Mr. Goble, thank you very much for your time, for being with us. I'd like to start with the Sochi meeting, Putin, Pashinyan, Aliyev. What do you think made this necessary? What was the necessity for that?
The necessity was all in Putin's thinking. In the last few months, both Brussels and Washington have been playing an expanded role. Vladimir Putin wanted to send a very clear signal that he's still a player, so he had this meeting, and it ended in much the same way his earlier meetings have ended, with some pretty grand declarative language about non-use of force, but in fact, no real agreements on moving forward toward a settlement. That's been largely ignored in the West and in Moscow. But in fact, Sochi really didn't move anything forward. That if you look at what the two sides said before the meeting and what they said after the meeting, there was almost no movement. Even the pledge not to use force has been heard before. So Mr. Putin tried to claim a great victory. If you're powerful enough and you control the media, you don't have to bother actually achieving a victory to claim one. But I think we should see Sochi as all about Mr. Putin's desperate need to keep Russia relevant in the South Caucasus, rather than being a major step forward. I mean, I think the easiest way to see that is a suggestion by the Armenian side that Russian peacekeeping units, so-called peacekeeping units, should be kept on Azerbaijani territory for the next 15 to 20 years. Nothing came of that. There was no agreement to do that. And that shows pretty clearly that if that's what Putin really wanted to have happen, Azerbaijan wasn't having anything of it.
Having said that, it doesn't matter that Moscow is gonna give up its so-called Moscow plan, and the same thing is envisioned in the Moscow plan as well, the mandate of the Russian peacekeepers. So the fact that it's not in the final communique, do you think the issue is out of the table?
Well, what I think is that that Azerbaijan didn't agree to it. I think that Azerbaijan is going to probably be very insistent that those so-called peacekeepers not be there more than 5 years, unless other nations are involved, either the Europeans or the Turks, as a balancing force. I think the idea that Russian troops should be on Azerbaijani territory is ultimately unacceptable to Azerbaijan. The Russian forces that are in Karabakh and the adjoining areas are not peacekeepers under international law. Peacekeepers are supposed to be from countries that are not connected with the conflict. Russia has a military base in Armenia. It has been Armenia's primary supporter over the years. It certainly has not been even-handed, has not been apart from the conflict, and under international rules, that's not where peacekeepers are supposed to come from. Peacekeepers for this conflict should have come from Sweden or Brazil or something like that. That they didn't was a reflection of Putin's insistence and Armenian fears. But the fact that there was no movement on this, whatever Mr. Putin says, I don't really, we talk about a Moscow plan. With respect, I'm not sure I know what that is, other than keeping the conflict going. The Russian plan, so-called, doesn't call for addressing real final status for the Armenian community in Azerbaijan. It simply says that their rights should be respected, a very airy, very undefined terminology. You can call that a plan if you like, but it seems to me that what it is a reflection that Russia wants to keep this conflict going. It wants to keep Russian troops on the ground in Azerbaijan, that some Armenians see that as the least bad alternative. Very few people in Baku think that's a good alternative for Azerbaijan. And what else is there? All of the statements from the November, January, and subsequent summits of the three have been declarative language. They've said what they would like to see happen without any specific agreement that says, we will do X on this date and we will do Y on that date, and it will all lead to these outcomes. So I don't think we've seen great progress as a result of Sochi. I think there was far more progress in Brussels, and I think there's been more in the bilateral conversations between Armenian and Azerbaijani officials. So I put my hope that those bilateral conversations, with the role of the Europeans, will move things forward rather than any expectation that the Russians will. It seems to me, if you look at what Putin said and the fact that there was no real agreement coming out of Sochi, that what the Russians are about are just two things. One, that there not be any final settlement, and two, that Russian troops stay on our Azerbaijani territory. Beyond that, I can't specify what a Russian peace plan for Karabakh and adjoining areas looks like. And I'm quite sure that Azerbaijan doesn't accept that. Azerbaijan insists quite clearly that it has to be able to restore complete sovereignty over the entire territory that was occupied for so many years by Armenian forces. And clearly, Azerbaijan has made it clear, a variety of Azerbaijani officials, that they don't want to see permanent Russian basing on their territory under the guise of peacekeeping. So, as I say, it's another summit, a lot of PR coming out of Moscow suggesting how this shows how Russia is still relevant. Yes, Russia is still relevant. It doesn't want a settlement, and it does want to keep Russian troops in the South Caucasus. Is that a settlement in any reasonable sense? Is that a plan in any reasonable sense? I really don't think we can call it that.
Mr. Goble, the sides are saying, talking about the possibility of peace agreement signing by the end of the year. Now, Russia may be weaker than before, but it still has a lot of power in the Caucasus over leaderships in Azerbaijan, in Armenia. So how much damage do you think Sochi meeting could have made to this peace process?
Well, I think I must say the term peace process is one of the more unfortunate innovations brought to the world by Henry Kissinger. A peace process can go on forever. A peace settlement is not so open-ended. My own sense is that there are going to be some agreements before the end of the year between Baku and Yerevan. Both governments have reason to want that. How many of the many issues? I mean, this is not a simple thing. These two countries have been at war, in effect, for 30 years. To unpack all that requires addressing a large number of issues. Might there be an agreement on the borders, even in the Lachin area, or the alternative transit route that's being talked about going alongside where Lachin is? Could there be an agreement on that? Possibly. Could there be an agreement on how to handle the enclaves, Azerbaijani enclaves inside of the borders of Armenia? Yes, that's possible. Could there be an agreement on the opening of a transit corridor across Zengezur-Syunik? That's possible, but my own guess is it's less likely. The question of a final settlement, that is to say, an agreement on the part of Armenia to recognize Karabakh as part of Armenian territory over which Armenia has...
Azerbaijan's territory.
Excuse me, Azerbaijan territory. Sorry, I misspoke. To accept that as being permanently Azerbaijani territory over which Armenia has no voice, I find it almost impossible to imagine a declaration like that. There would be too many people in Armenia who wouldn't want to hear that, and there would be mass protests. Moreover, Moscow can be counted on to play up those concerns. Um, could there be an agreement on the final withdrawal of Russian peacekeepers? Probably not. Again, so you're if you want to say, are there going to be some agreements between now and January 1st, 2023? I think that's possible. I think the two sides, precisely because they've been talking so much, can sign a variety of smaller interim agreements. I think the possibility of a grand peace settlement, a peace treaty in the two is unlikely. I suspect the biggest thing that people would be looking for would be the reopening of embassies in both countries, and so you'd have a much more intensive set of conversations even than they have right now. That won't be easy. Note, please, how long it took Azerbaijan to open an embassy in Israel. They've recognized it, but they've recognized Israel for a long time, and Israel has recognized Azerbaijan for a long time. But only now are we talking about opening an embassy in Israel. And I think the possibility of a declaration about we're going to establish embassies, that could happen by December 31st. I doubt very much that even the embassies could be set up by December 31st. So again, some agreements, a grand settlement, I think very unlikely.
Mr. Goble, watching Putin even holding this meeting with Pashinyan and Aliyev at a time when his soldiers are being killed, are dying, are losing in Ukraine, that threatens, frankly, his own power, his presidency, his future, whether he'll be alive tomorrow. Brings a lot of questions. Why does he even bother? What is this timing?
I think it's precisely because he's losing in Ukraine that he wanted the meeting in Sochi. I think it's precisely because Russian forces are doing so poorly against the Ukrainians. I think it's precisely that led him to feel, I want a summit meeting with people that I can present as I'm the negotiator. I'm keeping the Europeans out. I'm making Russia still relevant. And to be honest, the international media has fallen for that. But if you look at what actually came out of Sochi, what agreements were announced, what Putin got was some 2 days of PR and not much else. But he is in a sufficiently weak position that that's something he's willing to grab for. And I think we should understand that Sochi is not a reflection of Putin's self-confidence, but a reflection of Putin's own weakness. And my guess is that that's very well understood in both Baku and Yerevan.
So how do you think he can possibly play this card in the future, this Karabakh card? I mean, as he continues to lose.
Well, all you have to imagine is to restart fighting, which is awfully easy to do, given how many different groups there are on the Armenian side, not just Armenian military, but irregular Armenian forces who have guns. You could stage a provocation, or you could simply arrange for troops not to be present somewhere and someone takes advantage of the situation. You could restart. That's one thing you could do. Another thing you could do would be to play, to appear to shift sides on some key issue that would have the effect of leading one side or the other to decide to try to solve things militarily. If, for example, Moscow were to completely renege on its promises in November, the November summit, to have a corridor across through Zengezur. I think that there would be many people in the Azerbaijani capital who would say, all right, if they're not going to do that, then we will end the Karabakh conflict, but we will do it on our own, and we will do it independently of Russia. I do not think that Russian forces would shoot back at Azerbaijani troops. I think they would be pulled, and I think when that happened, Russia would find itself in a very much weakened position in the South Caucasus. That limits the likelihood Russia would do something like that. On the other hand, spreading rumors that you might do something like that is also a political tool, and we could expect to see that as well.
Iran has become an active player recently, and I don't mean just by sending drones and rockets to Russia, but also holding military drills on the border with Azerbaijan, imitating that is crossing the Araz River, that is gonna, invade Azerbaijan. By the way, Azerbaijan is also holding in response its military drills as well. But do you think this behavior by Iran somehow encouraged by Russia? Does it also help Putin in his war game?
Putin will certainly try to make use of it. I wonder whether Putin really encouraged it. The Iranian behavior in and of itself suggests that people in Tehran have calculated how weak Moscow has become. Think about it for a minute. Moscow right now is having to get military equipment and ammunition and guns from Iran. Think what that says. Russia is used to exporting those kinds of things. It's now importing them from Iran. That hasn't been lost on anyone in the region. I think the Iranians are also happy to engage in saber rattling because they have their own domestic problems. There are mass protests in most major Iranian cities. Ginning up a war scare is always a convenient way for an authoritarian regime to win support in its population. And so talking about, crossing the Araks or something like that, there are people in Iran who might say, well, maybe we don't like what the Ayatollahs are doing, but at least they're right on that, that kind of thing. And so I think that we shouldn't think that this was a Putin effort. The fact that the Iranians felt confident enough to move forces up there and to do it so publicly is a signal of their judgment and the judgment of others that Russia is no longer the paramount power it was in the South Caucasus. It's an indication of just how messy things could get. Is Putin likely to try to use this to say through his diplomats in Baku, you see what happens when you aren't cooperating with me? The Iranians do this. But I don't see that being a very persuasive argument, because I think bottom line is everyone in Baku can see that Russia is importing military equipment from Iran, not exporting it. That's not something that gives you the feeling that Russia is in charge here. Russia is trying to play catch up. Russia is trying to exploit the actions of others. This is not the same thing as Russia being the grand chess player that it's sometimes been presented as being.
Now Biden saying we're going to free Iran. You don't hear that kind of statements every day. How?
No, we don't.
I know that the officials are already trying to to ease it, saying that he's just been expressing solidarity. But we're gonna free Iran. What does it tell you? Is it a promise?
Let's be very clear. The United States and Iran have been at odds for almost as long as the Karabakh dispute has been going on. The Iranians sacked our embassy. They chanted death to the great Satan. They were our opponents in various geopolitical ways. They're the chief opponent in the Middle East to Israel, which is the United States' closest ally in the region. Obviously, the United States has led the sanctions, the imposition of the sanctions regime over the question of Iran's nuclear program. The United States is always worried about Iran causing trouble in the Sunni Muslim world that would threaten the flow of oil. It's concerned about the possibility that Iran might launch a strike against the state of Israel. The Israelis are concerned about that. It's not surprising that there are people in Washington and elsewhere who have an emotional sense that it would be a great thing if we could radically change Iran. And over the longer term, that's possible. I think that President Biden's choice of words in this case reflected more that underlying sense of it would be desirable than an indication of exactly what's going to happen next week.
The elections in U.S., do you anticipate any change in the policy towards Ukraine? Well, there will be less support to Ukraine, do you think, as a result?
Well, we simply don't know what the results are going to be. Things are very closely drawn. Both the Democratic majority in the House and the Democratic majority in the Senate may not be there after this election. We simply don't know. There are some who believe that the Republicans will regain control of the House, although there are fewer people, it seems to me, who think they'll regain control of the Senate. But again, we're talking about a very evenly divided political system, at least as far as I can tell, looking at the polls and reading various commentaries. Having said that, if the Republicans take control of the House, let's say, it's already becoming very clear that it will be far more difficult, not impossible, but far more difficult for the United States to expand the amount of military assistance it's providing Ukraine. I think the question of some of the more scary scenarios of what a completely Republican Congress might do are probably unrealistic in the next 2 years, because after all, the president can veto measures, so he can prevent things from being done, but getting what he wants through may become increasingly difficult. And that may require compromises that are difficult to specify when we don't know. If the Democrats have a five vote majority in the Congress and in the House of Representatives, one kind of thing happens. If the Democrats have a 5-vote minority in the House, that's something else. If they have a 20-vote minority in the House, as some Republican strategists have suggested, then we're in a whole new world. I can't answer your question because I don't know what it will be. I'm inclined to think that the Democrats will hold the Senate, possibly picking up 1 or 2 seats, and that the House of Representatives will be very, very close. But whether it will be with a 5 or 10 seat Republican majority or a 5 or 10 seat Democratic majority, that I'm not sure of at all right now.
When you say it's going to be a completely different kind of world, this is a figurative speech, or do you think that really it will make a huge difference in approach to Ukraine?
If Russia steps up its forces, if Putin has another wave or 2 of mobilization, if the size of the Russian invasion force is not 150 or 200,000, but 500,000 or 750,000, then if the United States is not in a position to radically expand its military assistance, Ukraine will have a very difficult time. If, on the other hand, the United States can, if there's are democratic majorities in both houses, then I think what you'll see is an expanded American commitment to meet any Russian challenge. So that's a huge swing. We don't know where things are coming. We also don't know whether the Republican Party will line up behind the most radical critics of supporting Ukraine. There are Republicans, there are Republicans who don't agree with that. I mean, historically, the Republican Party was in favor of a strong national defense, helping our allies in NATO and more generally. And so my guess is there are still Republicans in that who have those views. How many of those will speak out? How many of them will feel confident enough to make that argument in public and to vote accordingly? We're just going to have to see. And what kind of deals a President Biden can make to try to get things through, again, we have to see. I personally would be much more comfortable with Democratic majorities in both houses so that the United States could respond forcefully if the Russian government expands its aggression against Ukraine.
I want to go back to the Caucasus region. U.S. State Secretary Blinken is hosting a meeting with Azeri and Armenian counterparts, foreign ministers here in D.C. Now, is this a good signal coming after the Sochi meeting that apparently not huge damage is made?
Sochi happened. I don't think Sochi matters all that much. I think much too much has been made of Sochi. I think that what the U.S. Secretary of State is doing is a natural part of the ebb and flow of diplomatic activity. It's entirely appropriate for the United States as a world power to have conversations with people on different sides of conflicts to see what, if anything, can be done to prevent those conflicts from getting out of hand and causing trouble for American national interests. I think it's also a reminder that if 10 years ago the assumption was that whether we liked it or not, Russia was going to be the overwhelming dominant power in any resolution of the Karabakh dispute, now that's no longer believed. That there's a view that Russian power is in recession, that Russia is tied down in Ukraine, that the Europeans, the European Union, and also the Americans have a much greater opportunity to play a role. So I would say it's a very positive development. I hope that the Secretary of State and the U.S. government more generally doesn't get caught like a deer in the headlight about Sochi. Sochi happened. Okay, Putin had a meeting with the presidents of these two countries. That's fine. It didn't lead to anything. Now the Americans and the Europeans are having meetings with senior officials of Azerbaijan and Armenia in the hopes of finding a way forward. That's how diplomacy works. And I think on balance, it's a very positive development for the possibility of movement forward. We'll see.
Now, speaking at the Valdai Discussion Club, Putin referred to some kind of Washington plan, saying that, look, we're open to any decisions that you make, even if you decide to adopt the Washington plan that recognizes Nagorno-Karabakh as a part of Azerbaijan. Now, why do you think Putin was referring or making even public these comments? What was the purpose behind?
Well, I think Putin at Valdai was trying to present himself as a great statesman, as somebody who's looking at the bigger picture, who recognizes that there are many issues out there where many equities are involved. He wanted to show himself as a leader of a major power. He's not going to get down in the weeds. This was a way of saying, look, we can arrange this. We're still players. We still have military on the ground. You don't. We'll work something out. But of course, we'll listen to other people. That kind of statement, that kind of rhetoric plays extremely well with the kind of people who are at Valdai or who pay attention to Valdai conferences. The Russians have presented Putin's speech at Valdai as if it were the equivalent of his speech at Munich in 2007. The fact is, what he said in Valdai contained absolutely nothing new. There was nothing new except some very bravado terms about a new world order that he was going to construct. But even that language, all of it he has said before. This was not a turning point. This was not something that we should be studying to look for this or that change. This was a man trying to present himself as still a world leader. This, again, it seems to me that we have to understand that Putin is no longer in the position he was in before he very foolishly decided to invade Ukraine. He has been much weakened, and what we saw at Valdai, I think, is another indication of that.
It also sounds to me like an invitation to Armenian people to stand up against Pashinyan government, to get rid of him. Like, look, I'm trying to defend this so-called Nagorno-Karabakh Republic here, but your leader is alongside United States, which recognizes territorial integrity. Do something about it.
Well, the thing is, that's been the Russian line for a very long time. That if you say territorial integrity über alles, and as the Americans tend to, as the West tends to, because we believe in this, we believe in that international borders should not be changed by force alone. Then, if you want to make friends with a large part of the Armenian political class, saying, well, we are willing to do that, of course. And would Putin like to get rid of Pashinyan? Absolutely. Has he been able to do it? No. That also is striking. I remember early on in Pashinyan's, when Pashinyan came to power, there were very many people who were predicting that the Kremlin would orchestrate his departure rather quickly because they could play the Karabakh card so effectively. It hasn't happened. Pashinyan has proved himself to be a vastly more effective politician than many expect, and I think the role of the Karabakh lobby, if we can call it that, in Yerevan is now much smaller than it used to be. After all, Pashinyan is the first leader of Armenia since 1991 who has not built his career or even been born in or come from Karabakh. And I think that what he's saying and doing reflects his understanding and his defense of Armenia's national interest. Many people would say that he should be defending Armenians' national interests, but he's defending a country, the Republic of Armenia. And he's finally come to the conclusion, which I think was available for a long time, that the only way forward for Armenia is to get a peace settlement. I think Armenia has much greater interest in having a peace settlement because it would reopen some of the transportation corridors, open the way to greater Western investment, open the way to economic development in Armenia. If that means sacrificing the rhetoric of the Karabakh War, then I think Pashinyan is probably prepared to do that. He has to move in that direction carefully because there are a lot of Armenians who have bought the idea that Karabakh is the only issue that matters. And given Armenian history in the last 150 years, a history of geographic and demographic contraction, it's not surprising that they should feel that way. Having said that, Pashinyan is, I think, committed to an agreement, at some point a settlement, so that he can get the kind of transportation and communications links that might make it possible for Armenia to finally develop. I have no doubt that, and this may not be popular in Azerbaijan, but I have no doubt that Pashinyan is a committed Armenian patriot committed to the Republic of Armenia. But he does not necessarily believe that he should sacrifice the future of the Republic of Armenia in the name of Karabakh, as some of his predecessors quite clearly thought they could with Russian help. That proved to be wrong, and Pashinyan is, I think, has more power today than he did, and he does because I think increasingly Armenians are recognizing the justice of his position.
The Ruben Vardanyan, one of Moscow's billionaire oligarchs, has been dispatched, has moved to Khanki and Stepanakert, and he alleges that he abandoned his Russian nationality passport just before moving, or maybe a couple of months before moving to Stepanakert. Now, what do you think is Moscow's plan with regard to Rubenyan, and also the separatist regime in Khanki? Can it even survive without Moscow's support, approval?
Well, I think that I would say that the possibility of a kind of partisan war by those people is a very real one. I don't think the regime as a institutionalized structure can survive very long without a Russian presence. And I think the willingness and ability of the Azerbaijani army to move, if that group does move in toward partisan war, is such that that's a constraint. If Armenians in Karabakh give Azerbaijan an excuse to move, I don't think the Armenians can win. And I think the Armenians know that. They can only survive if the Russians stay there. That's why Pashinyan talked about 15 to 20 years, a statement that apparently got absolutely no support from Azerbaijan, because it doesn't feel it needs that anymore.
Was he calling Putin's bluff? Because that's the impression I got. It's like, if you want your forces there, I don't mind. Even 15, even 20, even 25 years. If you can agree that with Baku, I'm fine with that.
No, the forces are not on Armenian territory. They're on Azerbaijani territory. So Armenia has no problem calling for Russian forces to be on Azerbaijani territory. Let's be clear. The real question is, does Azerbaijan want Russian forces on Azerbaijani territory? And I think the answer is no. I think that there were good reasons why Azerbaijan behaved the way it did at the end of the 44-day war. I think that the idea of extending the Russian mandate to 15 years is a non-starter.
And my last question, how much a game changer do you think the EU mission or EU observers mission can be on Armenia-Azerbaijan border? We know that Baku is looking nervously at this mission.
Well, I think that there are the EU observer mission by itself isn't going to do a lot. It is going to do one thing Azerbaijan isn't going to like, because the Europeans can be expected to talk about human rights issues in ways that probably no one else is going to on the ground. At the same time, I think the fact that the EU is doing this, and doing it without so much as a request to Moscow to clear it, shows that there's been a change in the balance of power in the South Caucasus, and that the Europeans, the Americans, and others are going to be players there, whether Moscow likes it or not. Sochi was a desperation play by Putin to try to show he still matters. It convinced some people of that, but I think the fact that at the very same time you're getting an EU mission there shows otherwise. And if I were sitting in Baku, I would say that's vastly more important to my interest than any criticism that the EU mission may levy against the Aliyev regime.
And there's interestingly striking contrast between what how people view this EU mission and the government. A lot of experts I talk to see no problem with EU mission on Azerbaijani side as well. The more Europe, the less Russia means peace.
I think the fact that the EU mission is there at all, I would think welcoming it on both sides, the Azerbaijani welcoming it on the Azerbaijani side, would be a very smart thing for Baku to do. I think the costs are minimal, the benefits are enormous, because if you want a signal that Moscow isn't the only sheriff in town, this works very well in that direction.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Goble. Always great talking to you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.